panel discussion with a number of law enforcement leadership from across the country. We've got a few panelists here today. This is Restoring Public Trust in Law Enforcement. It's a two-part webinar series. This first part today is going to be an hour long, and it's really a discussion on how did we get here. In other words, how did we get to a place where there has been a recent decline in the public perception of law enforcement. Part two of that will be in a few weeks, and we'll talk a little bit about how we can go about curbing that. And again, we'll be bringing in our law enforcement leadership to discuss that. Two separate panels, one today and again on October 15th. With that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, John Bird.
Hi there. Thank you, Chris, and I'm happy to be here. We've been prepping for this for some time, so excited to introduce our panel and get into our discussion at this point. So we'll be, we advancing, there we go.
So just a little bit about the agenda today. We'll have our welcome, which we're doing right now, and then John's going to introduce our panel and allow each of them to introduce themselves. Take half a minute or so to introduce their background and their current position in law enforcement. Then we'll get into the actual discussion. We'll be covering a number of different topics around this particular subject. And then we're going to open it up for the last 10 or 15 minutes for a question and answer. You can submit your questions via the chat function here on the webinar. And we'll have, again, we'll leave some time at the end to have that discussion. And then we'll do a brief preview of part two, again, on October 15th, the second webinar in this series. So, John, you want to go ahead and introduce our panel?
Yep, happy to do that. So hopefully you can see our slide here change. Go ahead. So we've got, just bring them all up for me. We've got Russ Hauge, who's been with Kitsap County for a number of years. Russ, if you'd say hello and just give, like Chris said, maybe a 20, 30-second overview on who you are and what you've done.
Sure. My name's Russ Hauge. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for over 30 years. I started out in the prosecutor's office in Kitsap County as an intern. I was elected prosecutor in 1994 and served for 20 years. During that period of time, I also acted for 17 years as the legislative chairperson for the Prosecutors Association for the state of Washington, meaning that I was one of our lead lobbyists and was involved in most of the public policy discussions regarding justice in Washington state and around the country. We also defended the county whenever a claim was made against a police officer for conduct on the job. I'm currently working as a consultant for the Council of State Governments Justice Center, working with prosecutors' offices around the country. And I'm also was recently appointed as a board member to Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board, which we will not be talking about today.
That's the next webinar, right, Russ? Very good. Thanks so much. Harry Dolan, would you say a word about yourself? We've got Harry. Happy to have Harry here from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Well, thank you. Harry Dolan, retired police chief from Raleigh. I'm a trainer with the Public Agency Training Council. I am also a police chief from Grand Rapids, Michigan, was in the policing business for 32 years. So I've done a lot of training from the North Pole, Alaska, Anchorage, all the way to the Virgin Islands. Been retired for 3 years and trained primarily in the areas of leadership development and verbal de-escalation training.
Wonderful. Happy to have you. Hey, Ted, if you'd say a quick word. We have Ted here who's now in the Louisiana area, and Ted, you've done an awful lot of things too. Help us know what your background is.
Ted Sexton, 37 years in law enforcement, retired, was a sheriff in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, home of the University of Alabama, for 22 years, and was an assistant secretary at the United States Department of Homeland Security. Was a past president of the National Sheriff's Association, and then went out to Los Angeles and was the chief of the Homeland Security Division and retired out. I am a law enforcement consultant and a part of the criminal justice faculty at the University of Alabama.
Wonderful. Great to have all three of you here. It's so awesome to have your level of experience and insight, especially for this discussion. Part of our interest here is just as citizens of this great country, seeing what's taken place in recent years is concerning to all of us. So Chris, myself, and of course speaking for Paladin, the company we're working for, we're just happy to host this dialogue for the good of where things could go and hopefully will eventually go. That said, I want to quote to you from a fairly recent article from Richard Johnson. Harry, I think you've got some connections with Richard, maybe some others of you do as well, but Richard recently opened up an article with this comment. He said, over the past 2 years, it seems that overall public support for law enforcement officers has declined. Media coverage of police activities has been markedly skewed towards covering news stories that display law enforcement officers in a negative light. I think we could all agree with it. Ted, I want to start with you, though, on this discussion point to say this. In the broad scheme of things, it feels to me like this is new and this has never happened before, but I think you've got a better perspective historically to say this really isn't new. I don't think it's fair to say that this is new. Isn't that correct? And if so, kind of walk us through historically where we've been already.
Well, you're correct. If we look at it in a historical perspective, we had the Wickersham Committee back in 26. Back in the 60s, LBJ ordered the Law Enforcement Commission. And of course, 50 years later, we have the 21st Policing Task Force. But even when you look at what took place in 1983, when the crime statistics were climbing and people had concern about law enforcement, or you go back into the 90s, what took place in LA with Rodney King, I mean, we have been through these situations before. I think the biggest difference is that many of the folks that are involved in this are not getting their information from the traditional media. And are not necessarily reaching out to engage law enforcement or government in the conversation as we've been able to do in the past. You look at the statistical data of where many folks are getting their media, and it's coming from Facebook or Twitter or other social media, so therefore it's not, it has not been vetted in the same fashion that our normal media does. So that is one of the issues that's created and driving this force, just given Ferguson and the information that came out on Twitter being extremely inaccurate, but actually drove the issue.
Yeah, and when that doesn't get vetted right, and then later other information comes to light, oftentimes those false statements don't even get corrected on a public stage. Let me ask, Harry, I'm curious from your perspective, and we'll kind of look at the media thing a little bit more in a second here, but from your perspective, Harry, shoot from your hip assessment, are there the same amount of rogue cops today than in past times, or are there maybe a little bit more rogue cops today than before, or possibly are there less? What's your assessment of that one?
First I have to address, I think it's very kind to say that that the information has been reported wrong, and I do think that. And I agree with my colleague that people are getting their information from the wrong location. But it really concerning more than that is that it's the silence of leaders. It's the silence with people with the information. Whether it's the UCR or the CDC data on actual facts, that you, as a practitioner like me, not the academic, I stayed at a Holiday Inn, but I'm not an academic, but I try to at least, as a practitioner, review information. And if you have the good fortune to work with somebody like Richard Johnson, a PhD, who's just an incredible researcher, you call folks like that and you say, hey, Dr. Johnson, give me some data. What's going on? What do we have with use of force? And it's like what my good college professor would say to me in research methods. What problem are you solving here, Dolan? He would say that to me. I said, well, here's the problem. He said, no, I don't like your hypothesis. Give me some more data. And when I'm in this world out there with academics and people that have incredible degrees and are researchers, and you watch talk shows, and you just want to ask, well, how many people have died in police interactions? And then when you look under that that hood and you ask people that question, we got to set the context here. I think if we do our job right for the listeners, you know, when you look at the UCR data and you realize that 373 persons died from police justifiable homicides a year according to the UCR, or you get to the CDC data and look at 416 for legal intervention, and you compare that to close to 700,000 police officers, it does make one ask a question. You know, what is happening with policing that has caused this? And so a question that you ask is, what's the issue with rogue cops? I would tell you, or how many rogue cops? I've been in the business for 32 years and now as a trainer for 3 more. I don't think I've ever been more impressed with the men and women in law enforcement. And I mean this very candidly, and not just as somebody who's been a chief of 2 major cities, and one of the major cities in the country, Raleigh, you know, the 41st largest city in the country. These people coming into the business, these women and men, they're just absolutely incredible. And they're sitting back waiting for leaders to say, hey, ladies and gentlemen, 373, certainly those are certainly concerns to be looked at, but of all the police encounters in this country, will someone please set this context for us? And no one is. That's, I think, the real concern that a police officer on the beat would have. And, you know, then you have to ask the larger question, or the reality question that we're getting at, you know, how does that affect young black males or black males in this country? So we know that 120 black males a year were with police justifiable homicides. Well, we know that. Well, then compare that to the 4,430 criminal homicides, or the 162 justifiable homicides by citizens, or 119 firearm accidental deaths. We're not giving the basic, most rudimentary facts to our citizens, and they're not coming out from leaders that are academically capable of doing this, or more importantly, in a responsible position to do that, to set the context and give information. And that's where I see, when you asked a big question, I think, and rightfully so, how did we get here? Could you imagine, and what a wonderful way to start with my colleague Ted with the historical perspective, could you imagine the cops in the 60s or in the late 1800s in Teddy Roosevelt's time looking at the data that we have today with the drop in homicides and violent crime, and at the same time being criticized to the point that we are today, and then at the same time looking at data in surveys that put us above the media and above so many other groups in government and Congress as far as favorability, and yet every day the police officers that are in the streets are facing the kind of scrutiny they are, and with the Department of Justice data saying that citizens hold their police still in high favor, that they form their opinion of their police based on their most recent interaction with officers, that they don't form their opinion based on the media. Well, that's a lot to say to get started, but just to get the conversation started, no, that's a long-winded way of saying no, there's not more rogue cops. If anything, these men and women are the most trained in the history of policing, the most dedicated, the most professional. The tragedy is the leaders in the last 2 years haven't just dropped the ball. They're MIA. They should be in the podium. There's some, granted, absolutely. There's some strong leaders doing overtime, but I'm sorry, we've missed the ball here.
Well, you know, well said, Harry. And I guess a question I have to you, a couple of things, is do you reference the UCR data for current deaths at the hands of police officers? How does that compare to, say, last year and previous years? My assumption is you're saying that's gone down. Is that what you're saying?
That wasn't police officers. That's the citizens. I was giving you justifiable homicides. That what people are asking the question, because if you listen to the reports, well, for instance, let me say this. There is not a profession in the world, of any professions, that could withstand the scrutiny of American law enforcement. You know, for instance, we're told today that according to I think AMA, it ranges between 45 and 90,000 medical deaths, error deaths a year, that people die from errors that occur in hospitals and in medical care.
Right.
Well, you know, could you imagine if we had the focus that we have on the policing like we do in medical? You'd have to have a camera truck and a satellite in front of every hospital today. And we know that that changes because of the stage in someone's life. It's an end of death, I'm told by these medical folks. So when Dr. Johnson looked at that, it ranges in the 40s to 90. Well, 40,000? compared to the, whether you look at CDC or UCR, legal intervention versus police justifiable lethal force, et cetera, you're looking in the hundreds to 700,000 officers. We have to call a real timeout to take a look at the facts and look at what's going on, and I truly just think that that's absent. When it comes to officers tragically being killed, that number we've seen a slight increase in the summer, but here's what's happening because of the close media scrutiny. And here's a positive. Every officer's death, and it's so, it should be profiled on the news and talked about. We have lost officers tragically in this country, but we have never talked about them like we are now. That is a problem. When we hear that there's been an officer in Texas or in Florida and Texas getting gasoline and is executed at the gas pumps, that is all over the news. And tragically, that might have been a Texas story before. Well, now, because of this incredible scrutiny, we're covering that. But at the same time, we're also covering a lone officer, an individual officer that was not well suited for policing, just like a teacher who might not have been appropriate for teaching, or a minister. That one officer in the far reaches of a community, in a rural area even, makes a mistake, a significant mistake, and even something that could be considered a rogue officer, well, that'll be a national news story today. Even to a point of comment that wasn't a national news story. Going to be a national news story, and let's face it, that's going to do nothing but help improve the profession, but taken out of context, it leads to question like, well, there must be more and more rogue cops out there, when in fact the profession is doing nothing but improving by the decade.
Fair enough. And Russ, I'd like to get your take on kind of the same thing too, from your perspective, and you certainly have longevity to comment as well. In terms of the professionalism, are you seeing the same thing? It's gone up over time.
Oh, absolutely. I've been reviewing police reports for 30 years, and the quality of the work produced by officers on the street in jurisdictions large and small is unquestionably going up. That's in large part due to training, and it's also a byproduct of the microscope that's on police officers now. The officers themselves, their sergeants, their shift supervisors, their assistant chiefs, their chiefs are demanding accountability, and they want to answer those questions. But I don't want to lose sight of what really I think is the big point here that was brought up by the previous speaker, that we are in a profession where we are tarred with the same brush after that brush has been dipped into the worst possible situation you can imagine. Talking with our state legislature and legislatures in other states now with my consulting work, we constantly run into data from other states, or national data being applied completely inappropriately. For example, we hear over and over and over again that half of the people in prison are there for drug offenses. Well, that's just not true. That is true perhaps at the federal level, but the feds lock up a very small proportion of people in custody now. In Washington, for example, our population in prison for drug offenses is less than 9%. The people who are there because they've earned their way in by committing violent crimes or a series of destructive property crimes. And that's the same way across the country. Very few jurisdictions are justifiably criticized, both for the quality of policing and the overall output of their justice system, the way the media, the way our leaders seem to countenance.
Well, let me come back with that. I think it's a good point too. I guess one of my concerns would be, and not to bundle this at the feet of media and say that's the problem per se, but a media outlet, by definition, has got to get viewers, and if it bleeds, it leads. And so, Harry, you mentioned that leadership's been MIA. If the appropriate data, the correct data, gets pushed forward, would that matter? You know what I'm saying? Is media in a position to bring that in? Is that going to be? Is that going to sell a headline? Ted, what's your thoughts on that? How much does that matter to get that out there?
Well, I think that the factual data has not been released. You see a number of these justice institutes that are putting out information about law enforcement misconduct, and we have been absent. I think that's a really good point in regard to putting out the accurate information about the felonious or the number of persons killed, so on and so forth. We talk about Chicago. We talk about some specific cities that have the media now the concern about with crime rate going up in some cities. Does that mean that law enforcement officers are not doing their job because they're afraid to, due to the Ferguson effect? I think I go back to what I said in my opening comment. Folks are used to getting their news now on Twitter or short bursts on Facebook or other means. In order for us to be able to get out this statistical information and be able to get out these accurate figures, they would have to be able to read much more in depth unless we word this information in a way that is palatable to today's society, and especially to the society that is leading some of the organizations such as Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. But as I mentioned the other day in our conversation, I think people are missing the point that from a law enforcement perspective, our first duty and responsibility is to uphold the Constitution of the United States, no matter who you are. So in our case, where they're trying to limit us to say that a specific group lives matter, for us in the Constitution, it's clearly all lives matter. We're responsible to ensure that we take care of guaranteeing all persons' constitutional rights. But from a law enforcement perspective, getting to understand the medium and how we can get the message out in that short burst to better address those issues, that's one of the areas that we can definitely move forward in.
Sure. Ted, you brought up the Black Lives Matter movement. Let me just ask you, what is good about the Black Lives Matter movement?
It opens dialogue. It may not be the opportunity and the dialogue that many want, but if you have the opportunity to sit down and have the discussion and the opportunity for transparency, if it is a two-way dialogue, I think Chief Ramsey in Philadelphia has tried in the issue in his particular situation. It did not. I know of others that have. The question is, who are you dealing with? But if you don't attempt to have the dialogue, then you just can't have it. So, but I think people, they're exercising their First Amendment rights, and it can be frustrating. But we as police officers also need to understand that's a right that we protect, and it is something that we have to deal with and do a better job. But unfortunately, you look at Sandra Bland, you look at a couple of these other issues where, or the recent incident in I believe it was Surf City, North Carolina, where a comment was made about Black Lives Matter, and we have to understand that even though it frustrates us at times, First Amendment still stands, and it's there for a reason.
Certainly. Ted, I think one of the things along the way I suspect that have contributed to the growing professionalism and more prepared police officers is simply the hiring process. And I wonder if you'd speak to that. I mean, I know there's intentional efforts to engage, women, minority in the law enforcement industry. Talk about the hiring process over time and how you've seen that maybe evolve.
Who are you directing the question to?
Harry?
I think policing is a calling, and you're basically going to deal with people that really want to do this profession, like so many other professions where it stirs at your heart. It's never been a call of a paycheck. Some, certainly it does. It's a form of steady employment. But most of the people that come into this business, it's a calling, and they come from all different walks of life. And we've seen great diversity in some of our major cities. So I think recruiting, it first starts with people that truly want to do this job. And then it's up to the organizations to make certain that they're selecting the right people. And it's up to the governing bodies to become very, very realistic. With the rigors of this employment, with the rigors of this job, you simply can't pay someone $28,000, $30,000 a year to do this work. We can't have them working 60 hours a week, 40 hours for the police department, for the sheriff's department, and then working off duty. Kevin Gilmartin with Emotional Survival, Dr. Gilmartin, has done his work since the late 80s and early 90s, making it very clear to all of us they are on overload. They're hypervigilant, and some of the issues that we've seen with some of the individuals that have had some very catastrophic events have no rest. They're hypervigilant. Their prefrontal cortex is about exhausted. Their decision-making after about 24 hours puts them at the level of somebody who is at a 0.10 or higher in blood alcohol. Round the clock, working on and off duty. We wouldn't do that to many of our FBI agents and other officers in higher paid positions, but yet we take municipal officers and deputies and putting them in these situations. Recruiting, certainly recruit for the best. Make sure you have all the processes in place that we all know are the best, but make sure, more importantly, that in the probationary periods, the field training periods, when there's not a match rather, make sure you do the right thing. And when you do get somebody that it's calling, that everybody gives them the right benefits to move forward. And then now look at what we're dealing with today with the economy. Not only are we not increasing some of those pays, what are we doing? We're taking away the retirement. We're moving away from defined benefit. So now they'll be staying longer. So where somebody could have gotten a 25, 20-year pension, they're going to stay. They're going to have to stay to Social Security because their 401A or their 401K is dependent on the stock market. But that could take us to a whole new webinar. But recruit for best, recruit people for calling, and matter of fact, you call the ministers and people from the community to make sure, particularly in the areas of diversity, that they stand tall for the police department. Remember, all the people in the community are listening to the community leaders. And as they stand tall for the police officers, that will bring in the people who are calling. But if they don't stand tall for the police officers, it certainly hurts our recruiting efforts.
No, I think it's well said. And we've talked, too, with a number of law enforcement agencies that talk about, you get somebody in, you vet them as best as you can. At the end of the day, on paper, you can have someone that is the perfect candidate for a great law enforcement officer, but in practice, as you really get to know the personality of said person, you sometimes go, wow, it's just not a fit. And I think that's probably part of what you're suggesting. We'll shift gears here as we moving forward. There was a recent report from the Inspector General of the New York Police Department where a couple of important statements were made that and I'm reading this now, and this should be on your screen. Any significant law enforcement event has the potential to develop into a claim made against the agency and the officers involved. The law enforcement agency should consider not if, but when a lawsuit comes. I think another statement here on this one. In the past 5 fiscal years, 15,000 lawsuits filed against New York PD, a 44% increase in total number, costing the city over $200 million. In 2013 alone, settlements and judgments against NYPD cost the city $1.37 million. Russ, maybe speak to this. I mean, it's alarming. We come this whole way, and we've established that probably the law enforcement group across the U.S. is maybe most professional that we've ever had, and yet look at what's happening in New York. And this has happened not just New York, right, Russ? This is happening all over.
Oh, absolutely. It's I guess it's the byproduct of, you could say too many lawyers, or more charitably, the evolution of the legal system. But there's a lot of incentive out there to bring lawsuits for virtually any injury, particularly when you've got a deep pocket like the state or local government that employs a police officer. It's an issue that really I don't think accurately reflects what's going on, other than the how wide open the courthouse door is and how generous some insurers can be. Generous being used in place of the term cowardly. if you've got insurers who are going to do just the cost-benefit analysis, oh well, it might cost us a few $1,000s to a few tens of thousands of dollars to defend this lawsuit. Let's just pay the person. All that does is provide incentive to file the next frivolous lawsuit. So it is something that's not going to go away. It doesn't accurately reflect the current state of the law enforcement profession. And it speaks to really the other issues we've been talking about, collecting good information about what is actually going on so we can defend against these claims. That's what this tells me.
Sure. How important is it from your perspective to not settle out of court merely because there's an initial cost savings, but rather to fight it maybe from a longer term perspective? How significant is that in your estimation?
That is absolutely essential. There are cases that should be settled, and sometimes that's all you can do. But there are cases where officers, and I've been involved in it, and I'm sure the other panel members have too, they've seen instances where the officers did the best they could in a situation that they were called to respond to, and somebody got hurt. We have to defend those actions. And to defend those actions, we have to develop the information about that transaction, about the training of the officers, so that the people charged with defending the lawsuit, the insurance companies, the lawyers working for the insurance companies, have the tools to defend those suits.
Right. I think you had mentioned, we had talked some time ago, a week back, I think you had referenced a case which you classified as kind of a suicide by cop type of case.
Yeah.
And then a full 2 years later, the suit surfaced, and in your wording, it was really a slam dunk case to go, and fight, but yet it was settled, isn't it? I think that's what you had said to me, and I'm curious what that does to morale of the officer involved in the force at large.
Well, you can imagine. The case I mentioned was really pretty straightforward. Typical offender pattern. A young man with a long history of substance abuse, criminal activity, and mental illness lets it be known to his family and friends he's going to kill himself. They call the police. The police are the intervener of last resort in these situations. They show up, they do their absolute level best to provide help to the young man, but he's hell-bent on having them shoot him, and he comes at him with a machete. I reviewed the case personally. We looked at it very carefully. There was absolutely no fault on the part of those officers. However, as you said, 2 years later, the family files a claim, and our insurer, over the objection of my office, the sheriff's office, who employed the deputies, our county commissioners, everybody who had a stake in it other than financial, they settled the claim for 6 figures. And all it did was provide incentive to the next lawsuit, for the next lawsuit. And it had a terrible destructive effect on morale. The only thing that saved it from being, totally, the only benefit was that our responsible officials, the county commissioners in particular, stepped up and said this is wrong, and we got another insurer. But it's a problem that every department everywhere faces.
Yeah, it's real. Harry, let me ask you, and then Ted, just real quick, you chime in as well. In general, what's morale to, September 2015? What's morale like among local law enforcement officers, Harry?
Well, first, just a quick comment on the lawsuit. What is that? 3,000 lawsuits for 50,000 people? Am I right? What do they say? Looking here, 15,000 lawsuits. So what's that? What's that? 5 a year? 5,000 a year? 3,000 a year over 5 years? Is that right?
3,000, yeah.
Yeah, let's go with that. That's right.
In New York, with civilians included that do all that traffic control and all the things they do and all the cars that they drive and all the things that they do, what is it, 3,000 a year for 50,000 people?
Yeah.
Right.
You include slips and falls, and all the internal mess they have with the employee that they can get promoted. I don't know if they've included those. Yeah, and there's a 44% increase, and now you throw the morale issue on top of that. Well, I'd like to look at all those numbers. I said this is once more again statistics that are put together, and you see the cost of 137 million, and you look at the overall billion-dollar budgets that they have. You really have to put this in perspective. This is once again a quote put together out of the report that I sure would like to have a lot more information. But nevertheless, draw your attention to a New Jersey reporter did of the state of New Jersey when they looked at all of the lawsuits in the state. And I don't have the exact figures, but what I was struck by, my son's an attorney, he's a labor attorney, and he does a lot of training for police departments in liability and risk management. And he found that in his research of that article that the researcher found that 50% of the lawsuits, a little bit more, and the settlements went to internal members of police departments. And there was actually more money spent internally on the officers suing supervisors and supervisors suing mayors and vice versa than it had to do with the citizens. So the citizens actually sued less and received less financial compensation than the members did of the state of New Jersey and their police officers. So
well, that's
hard to look at that.
Interesting.
So to take on this climate now to say, well, that means that there's more uses of force, I'd have to take a harder look. Morale, what we have to look at right now is my first comment would be that everyone just take a pause and be very grateful that we live in a day that we've got in the world the very best police officers in the world. They're trained, they're munitions based, they make good decisions, they're a little sleep deprived, they're working too much, they're working too many hours. Right now we're starting to see another recruiting crisis in some of our major cities. We're starting to see an increase in crime. We would all be naive on this webinar and in the law enforcement profession to say that we're not seeing some significant signs of depolicing of officers, being very concerned that where their actions are resulting in complaints feeling put upon. However, I would challenge all those officers to make sure that they remember that in Ferguson, the citizens that came and what testified in the grand jury, that spoke with members of the federal investigation that came in, the good people from the Department of Justice, were honest, hardworking men and women that looked behind the blinds and saw everything that happened and came in and told the truth. And it's those citizens that just want to protect. So you get out of those cars, you have out-of-car experiences, and don't suffer from what Kevin Gilmartin refers to as a continuum of compromise. Be sure to do your job. Then that begs the question, or the comment rather, that we all talk about with police legitimacy. Legitimacy focuses on three key concepts. That number one, the citizens believe that their police have legitimacy, and legitimacy emanates from one, that they feel that there's fairness, that the police are fair, the law is fair, and that they're trustworthy, and that they're treated with respect. That the people enforcing law are trustworthy and they're treated with respect. If that goes askew, there's problems. And what we also saw in Ferguson was that the police were being used as a method to increase the city's budget, to balance the budget. And that's a lesson that few are really focusing on. I focus on two things. Number one, the citizens in Ferguson that saw an incident that was very controversial, saw an officer that was attacked in his police car, and came forward and told the truth. Not people that told falsehoods, people that told the truth. They believe in law and order, and they believe in their police. And they did that in an atmosphere that they did, in fact, have concerns of police legitimacy. Not about the police officers themselves, but an atmosphere where they felt that the police enforcement practices of tickets and citations were being used to increase the budget or to balance the budget, with a heavier burden put on the community of color. And that was a finding that was addressed in the federal report. That's called illegitimacy, that it's not fair, it's not trustworthy, or being treated with respect. With that said, where the issue of morale is concerning, that legitimacy is not one way. We have only to turn to Baltimore, where we see legitimacy right again. where an officer can go to a neighborhood and see a citizen has been shot, and see that the person is living their last breath, is leaving their body, they've had a bullet that went into their head, and they see their soul leave their body, and they turn to people in the area and ask if anyone saw it, and nobody saw anything. And that they try to do the very best, and then all of a sudden a family member comes along and they hear a cry and a scream that they don't want to remember, but they're going to have to remember for the rest of their lives. Right. And they get people to help out, and they get detectives to help, but it's a very, very difficult challenge. But no one wants to talk because that's bona fide fear, because no one wants that to happen to them in the middle of the day, because their whole altercation was over some trivial matter about music or shoes or something trivial. Well, that's fear, and the officer has to deal with it. Well, that same officer, 3 weeks later, maybe at a civil dispute, maybe somewhere else, where he's arresting somebody or she's arresting somebody for a bona fide reason, somebody who has been preying upon the community's innocence, has warrants, has been reckless in their treatment of other citizens, and goes to make an arrest, has to use a straight-on bar takedown, may even have to use a baton, as that officer's been trained, to subdue a violent suspect. And here come the cameras. Here comes the people complaining. Here comes the people wanting that officer fired. But the officer did everything they were supposed to do. No community leader is coming forward. In fact, they're wanting the officer fired. And then the officer is told, there'll be a report, we'll get back to you in a month. And everyone is upset. And then the officer sits back and he sees a community leader demanding his resignation or holding a protest. And that same officer says, number one, I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly. I don't feel like I'm being treated with respect. And maybe some of the leaders that I'm looking at, to me, aren't trustworthy. There lies legitimacy on both ends of the spectrum. And that's also maybe leading to your next webinar. That's where we need to be. That's where the future is. That legitimacy, for the police to be legitimate in the community, they have to be trusted. They have to be perceived as fair and trustworthy. And in the community, the police officer on the beat has to believe that that community leader, that reverend, that citizen is going to be trustworthy, just like the citizens in Ferguson were for the officer that was in harm's way, that they told the truth, that they were fair. That's what we need, legitimacy on both ends of the spectrum.
Well said, and Harry, I think you've kind of turned our discussion, really about the perfect time for me to segue just a little bit deeper as we're kind of, I think, culminating our dialogue. You said it's really at the end of the day on the law enforcement side about being a legitimate officer and certainly getting legitimacy back from the public. But what as law enforcement officers can we do when we get down to the core issue, when we become introspective about what can I do? And it feels like that's kind of where you just took us, Harry, which is to be legitimate. And fellas, let me just ask, Ted, I'll start with you here on this. If you were introspectively to say what piece of this whole downward spiral can law enforcement groups and officers own and say, this is what we can address for us? I can't necessarily fix you, but what can I address for me? Ted, where do you go with that? I think it has something to do with, as Harry said, treating people in a legitimate way that they perceive respect. What's your response to that, Ted?
Well, I think I'd like to step back for 1 second and talk about what the officers are saying right now.
Okay.
I think that it is relative to what you're discussing now, because as you are going through these slides, I can recall the video that came out regarding Seattle, and basically the officers were questioning the training. And as I recall, we're being told this is what we're told to tell you by the Justice Department. The question is buy-in. Many of these officers today, after seeing what's taken place in Baltimore and Ferguson, in other cities, are looking at law enforcement administration and saying, asking a critical question: is our leadership going to provide the actual leadership that we need to be able to move forward in these turbulent times? If we have an issue, is my police chief going to fold to the mayor and basically throw us under the bus? I think that's a great concern when you talk to the actual officer on the street right now that is functioning, and they turn around and say the guys that are making the decisions right now haven't seen the street for 15 years. So that is an issue that we have to look at as far as the morale and that basic function that we've been discussing. We cannot forget. Many of them feel that their safety has been jeopardized around the discussion of de-escalation, deconfliction, so on and so forth. They're struggling for what's the definition of that. Tell me what it is. The officers themselves, and going back to the question before that on liability, it comes down to the core sense of training and an understanding and having executives sit in on the training and ensuring that everybody is on the same page. Depending on what agency you're talking to and the leadership that's shown by the chief administrator, it goes from department to department. I see some change between the sheriff's offices and police departments in that the sheriff has the answers directly to the people, where the police chief in many occasions is answering through the mayor or through a city manager. So it's an issue that definitely needs further discussion and communications within the department, and we hire from the human race. So all these things that you've been talking about today all tie together as where we go, but we cannot forget that in this discussion and transparency that we have, it's not only with the community, but continuing to ensure that our officers are involved at all levels and that they truly understand the paradigms that we're asking them to go to. For example, unfortunately, the fire department after 9/11, or fire agencies after 9/11, learned that charging into a building and having your command post in the basement is not the greatest thing to do. I think in law enforcement, we're slowly but surely seeing that we don't need to charge every situation, that space and time, distance and time equals safety. But again, there are many officers that are having to change that paradigm that started 20, 25 years ago that have had that, I'm going to go directly challenge the issue and I'm going to solve it and move on. And I think that as we do that, the question about liability will be answered through training. Unfortunately, many training budgets have been slashed throughout the country to try to address fiscal deficits, but we're seeing it's a very delicate balance.
Well, and I think, Ted, it was you that we were talking about, the sovereign citizen group that tends to view with some rogueness of their own the authority of law. And I think your point at that time was sometimes it's okay to say, well, that guy maybe verbally is a ding-dong, but I don't have to win. And sometimes we need to learn to step back, or we need to learn to de-escalate situations such as that. And other times they escalate on their own, and we've got to stay in the pocket and deal with it. But there are times when it's okay to just say, well, and back down on our own.
Well, I think that in our training program, we hire the best candidates that we can find, and we want them to understand that they can use their brain, they can use their mouth to communicate, but hopefully they're thinking about what they're saying in some of these situations. And then there are people out here today that will do nothing but sit there with a camera or a recorder and wait for them to make a mistake and then publish it. That's one of the goals of Sovereign Citizen, or that's the goal of some of these organizations that we're dealing with. So I think that as we train, we need to let our cops know what's the goal of some of these other organizations. And unfortunately, it's looking at ourselves critically as to how can we be better, how do we defend ourselves from these potential lawsuits that are coming, and better understand, unfortunately, as I said early on, even though the First Amendment greatly frustrates us in some occasions, it is a citizen's right. And we have to understand more so of what is and what is not acceptable, and make sure that our officers understand that. By doing so, it saves us an awful lot of headaches. We don't necessarily have to win every skirmish or every battle. By backing off and getting additional help there, or waiting, or listening to them and let them walk away, that's great. And we saw that in North Charleston, as we discussed. You got the guy's driver's license, you got all these other things. Why do we have to shoot? But that's yet to be determined by the courts. So we're looking at new paradigms. I think the one that you have up here right now about the warrior versus guardian. I mean, our job is to be a guardian. Unfortunately, we have situations that take us to warrior, the Homeland after 9/11, Homeland Security, active shooter, these types of situations have put us in, it moved us towards that. But as far as law enforcement officers, we're there to guard and to assist persons. We're basically there as deacons. We're to serve. And I think that we look at some of the agencies that are out there and some of the things that folks are trying to do, and we're probably scratching our heads saying that's a little overboard for us. But I think as we can better articulate to our personnel the changes, just like we went through in the 60s, just like we went through in the 80s after King, it was law enforcement coming together and participating in the discussion on how to move forward. If we don't, folks are going to make decisions on how law enforcement moves forward with us. Or I'm sorry, if we're not involved in that conversation, they're going to make those decisions, and we may head down some roads that we really don't want to go down.
Yeah, well, it strikes me that the level of diplomacy required by the general officer out on the street is just extraordinarily high. In order for them to deal with, there's a lot of very well-informed citizens, there's a lot of very under-informed citizens, and Russ, maybe just as we're starting to wrap here, maybe chime in on the idea of, somebody might say to a law enforcement officer pulling them over, what are you arresting me for? And if it isn't arrest, then what right do you have to have my driver's license? Where do you go with that? I mean, I can't fathom personally ever saying that to a law enforcement officer, but it's happening. What rights what authority does law enforcement have? I think it's there, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, it's unfortunately a situation law enforcement officers on the streets face every day. The general rule, as everybody knows, is that if you are driving a car, you are in a contract relationship with the state that maintains those roads and has to guarantee the safety of the roads. So if you're stopped, you have to prove or show at least that you have the ability to operate that car and that you're financially responsible. At least that's the way it is in most states. That said, the point that I think it was Ted was talking about is that the officer has to balance that. The officer has that right to ask, and I think most officers are very well versed in the rules about when they can approach people and what they can ask them and what their limits are and what the responsibilities of the citizens are. But the other side of the equation, the citizens aren't as well trained and as well informed. And it comes down to that decision that the officer has to make. How far do I want to escalate this? And that is not something that, as an attorney sitting in the warm, dry, well-lighted office that I have, I'm going to second guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is part of the problem, is it not, Harry, as far as what type of de-escalation skills that are formally being taught and being monitored? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if that's generally a core piece of the curriculum.
I can help you with that. They're not being taught. That's the crisis. Cops learn it over time. We do two things. Two things we complain about the most in policing is that cops can't write reports and they can't talk to people. And we teach them that in the academy, and we wait for them to learn it over time. The one that they don't learn is the report writing. That's the one that they stress with the most. But they'll pick that up after a while when they get enough stress and strain. But they'll really pick up the communication skills. The good news here is that the communication skills will come with time. The good coppers learn it. It's called being a veteran. They always ask them, when you hear about people saying now we're going to have to teach our coppers how to disengage and this, don't worry about that. Veteran cops ask themselves a question as they get older, as they get more experience, and they've rolled around a bit. They ask themselves a question: just how important is this stuff? What am I dealing with here? Just how important is this? Don't worry, they know how to handle it. It just takes them a little time. What we have to do is we have to increase the learning curve. The good news here is, even though there's 700,000 of us in all the different agencies, we just have to get that learning curve done quicker. The other good news here is we've learned this a long time ago. There's someone I'll refer to by the name of Aristotle that's given us a hand here. Lawyers know that, and my colleagues that are lawyers know it, and they know the art of rhetoric. And we just have to get back to basics. Dr. George Thompson talked about it, so many others. And the bottom line here is you approach people and you know what you're saying. My name is Harry Dolan. I'm with the police department. You know, the reason I stopped you was you went through that stop sign over there. Any reason for that? I don't have to do what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I got that. Now I'm going to deflect. And then I'm going to kick into something called ethos, pathos, and logos, pathos, and logos. And I'm going to tell you why I'm doing this. I'm going to give you options. I'm going to explain things to you. Cops learn that naturally over time. We're going to have to speed it up. The coppers are going to do a fine job with this, but the ask, tell, make, getting into debates, they got to learn, don't debate people, you're going to de-escalate. It comes over time. Well, let's expedite it, they're going to be fine. But that's what we're seeing on videotapes. Turn off the tape. No, turn off the tape. They can tape you, officer. Let's just take a breather here. And here's the other thing. You've already written a warning. It's time to leave, officer. It's okay. And the veteran didn't even write the warning because the veteran didn't even stop the car for that violation. We just have to pick up the pace and we'll be fine. And then when it comes to domestics and explaining things, we're gonna get there. The officers that are veterans that are suffering from some of the verbal exchanges are, in my opinion, aren't a veteran. They're still an amateur. They're still a recruit. Let's train them. Let's get them up to speed, and we're going to make headway there. But we're going to have to turn that dial up. I don't think we have to worry about officers leaving scenes with people mad, because I got to tell you something. American law enforcement officers solve problems. They keep the peace. It's very hard for them to leave a scene with unrest visible. It's just not in their DNA. Sure. I mean, from the academy on, now for them, it's going to be anyone who wants to train them that is going to have a very hard time. They're going to hear all kinds of complaints in the training room. But you would be better off trying to teach them on how to get the positive, the negative options out and walking them through it. So we'll get them there. They're going to do swell.
Chris, if I may,
yeah,
Chris, if I may, PERF just released a study of law enforcement academies surveyed across the country, and they brought up one specific point in their study, in their research, in the comparison between firearms training, defensive tactics, constitutional law, in comparison to crisis intervention, de-escalation, and mental health. Generally, courses between 6 to 8 hours during an academy, where others are up in the high 40s to 50 per hour. So that's just showing that some of the priorities that we're emphasizing in the discussion and the paradigm shift we're not seeing that brought forward in the training aspect, and that's going to be an important aspect of what we do. Let's make sure we train what we're finding to be some of the most important issues.
What a great point too. And although those are critical tasks that you just mentioned, but really astute point. Every day those officers are using their verbal skills in their pen or their keyboard, right? And when we look at those really critically needed skills, we need to expand that view. I think that's a good point.
Well, it's so well said on each of your part here, and appreciate your contribution to the discussion. I think, Harry, to paraphrase what I think I just heard you say, wisdom brings this, and that's the ability to choose your battles. I mean, I do that with my kids. I do that at work. We've all got to do that, and I think what you're saying is we've got to short circuit that learning curve so that gets to our officers sooner. And that's where training comes in. Ted, one thing I'm going to reference that I think you had mentioned in our previous conversation was regards to, and please correct me if I put the wrong words in your mouth, but that the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of police discretion, provided that law enforcement officers had the adequate training. I think that's something that you said. Is that right?
Well, I think you're getting back into Connor versus Graham versus Connor, and you're moving into the use of force issue. But what I had mentioned was, I think that in the discussion that come forward, people are not familiar with the ruling or how this applies to the use of force. The lines have become so blurred now that many in the public don't understand the actual rights of a police officer in making an arrest and what happens should that participant resist that arrest. So there's a number of issues that are out there that unfortunately we don't have time, nor do we have the ability at times to translate that to the community.
Yeah, fair enough. And another thing that I mentioned, I remember you saying, Ted, at one time was, you know, an element of violence is always going to be there. You can't eliminate that. But I think really where we're focusing at this point is, what about the unnecessary violence? Is there some unnecessary violence that we can learn to de-escalate over time? And I think that's really where we want to just kind of land this discussion today, is that, you know, there really are some things that that law enforcement can do, and it gets back to the training component. I've got a final slide here that just references the overall cost of this. And Russ, I think you mentioned it. It's easily 6 figures every time you get a phone call, not a phone call, pardon me, but every time you get into some kind of a suit here. And this slide here from the Washington Post states the monetary cost here is currently plaintiffs are prevailing at approximately 1 out of 3 lawsuits, with the average payout of $450,000. And perspective is this: the cost of training, if we can do what we've just now mentioned, is to learn to short circuit some of the learning here, is a relative bargain compared to the price of neglecting it. Final comments from you, Russ?
Well, Chris, this is Ted. I've got to go teach a class, so I'm going to have to sign off. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate with you all today.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely the major point here, is that the investment that we have in giving officers the tools that they need to effectively deal with people on the street is always money well spent, and is going to be far less than the ultimate cost of when things go bad. Things will go bad. People will make frivolous claims. The other side, or the next step, is to make sure that we understand and keep records of what that training has been, and exactly what the history of our law enforcement agencies are in dealing with folks, and not just rely on the latest Twitter feed or what is trending on CNN or in the academy.
Well said. Thanks so much. And gentlemen, to all of you, I think it's been really well received on our side, and hopefully our participants online would agree. We'll continue this on our next webinar, which is October the 15th. And in that part, we're going to just unpack a little bit more in detail how training can enhance the perception issue, and what does that look like specifically? What are some of the resources in regards to this? And Harry, I think you've got some that we might be able to talk about. How do we strike a balance between the guardian versus the warrior? Because at the end of the day, demilitarization also has to be balanced with, well, we've got a school shooting and we've got to go deal with that with true military type of tactics. And so we'll talk about that, and assessing law officers to make sure that they're kind of a good fit moving forward. We'll kind of cover all of those things as we move into our next session. So thanks for being a part of this, everybody. Go ahead.
Just one last quick comment, because I wouldn't want to leave it unattended. Just about, sure. You mentioned the violence, and I know we're going to sign off and we'll get back on the 15th, but we can't not address the violence, and we got to make sure that when we talked about setting the context at the beginning of the presentation, we also have to talk about that the community needs to be informed, that we train the officers in the use of violence, that it's controlled violence, certainly it's trained, but we give them batons, we provide them with electric control devices. And I get concerned sometimes, and we see lawsuits, but you know, when you use a baton and the officer's protecting themselves from what they perceive or their actual use of serious violence against themselves or a citizen, we've got to do a much better job of making sure the citizens know they've been trained to do that. So certainly it looks at times like an awful thing to see. It is, but it's also lawful. And it's been far too often times that we're not doing a good job at providing the citizens with the education, and even sometimes the governing body of a community, the city council, the county commission, with the fact that we have in fact trained those officers to use those tools. We provided them with them when they're in harm's way or citizens are in harm's way, and that full context has to be provided. And I think that that'll be addressed even further in the next webinar.
Well said. Very well said. Thanks so much, gentlemen, and we'll connect again next time.
Thank you.
You bet. Bye-bye.